Okay, picture this. December 1835. The Texian volunteer army, they've just pulled off something incredible. They forced General Cos and his entire Mexican army out of Texas after the siege of Bexar.
Right. A huge victory. For a lot of those volunteers, that was it. Mission accomplished.
Exactly. They figured, we won the big one, the enemy's gone, and, well, a lot of them just packed up and headed home. They genuinely thought the war was basically over.
It's this real high point, peak Texian confidence early in the revolution. But, and this is the kicker, it's also the exact moment things start to unravel for their army.
Such a paradox. A complete stunning victory that just weeks later leads directly into this fight for sheer survival.
And it happens in the same place, San Antonio de Bexar, at the Alamo.
So the question for us today isn't really how the Mexican army eventually overwhelmed the Alamo garrison. We'll get to that story next time. It's how did the Texians themselves, right after their biggest win, manage to basically set themselves up for failure?
Yeah, how does total victory turn into a scramble for annihilation almost overnight?
It wasn't about battlefield tactics at this stage, was it?
No, not at all. The answer is, well, it's almost entirely political self-sabotage. And for you listening to this, it's a really stark cautionary tale. It shows the danger of, frankly, overconfidence and just toxic political infighting right after you've achieved something big.
They stopped fighting the common enemy.
And started fighting each other. Precisely.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to dig into the documents, the letters, the sheer political venom flying around as the provisional government just disintegrated.
And we'll trace those specific decisions, the really fatal ones, that led to this disastrous idea called the Matamoros expedition.
And see exactly how all that internal chaos left the frontier, especially Bexar, just wide open, dangerously exposed to an army bent on vengeance that, honestly, they didn't even seem to realize was coming so fast.
Right. Let's get into it.
Okay, part one. A government at war with itself. Where does this provisional government even come from?
It starts with the consultation. This is basically a gathering of representatives from across Texas. They got together in November 1835. Their goal was to create some kind of structure, a legitimate government to guide the fight.
And on paper, it looked okay, right? They set up a structure. The sources mention a governor, Henry Smith, as the executive.
Yep, Governor Smith. And then you had a legislative body, the General Council.
And they even appointed a commander-in-chief for the army, General Sam Houston. Seems organized enough.
It seems organized, but the foundation was cracked from day one. The fatal flaw was that the governor and the council majority had completely opposing ideas about what they were even fighting for.
So no unified vision.
None whatsoever. And that basic disagreement just paralyzed everything else they tried to do.
Let's break that down, because it really is the key. Governor Henry Smith, what was his position?
Smith was crystal clear. The sources call him an avowed friend of independence. He was totally convinced that Santa Anna's actions, his move towards centralism, meant Texas could never be safe as part of Mexico again. For him, the Rubicon was crossed. Time to declare independence, full stop.
Okay, so he's pushing for a complete break. How did the council feel about that?
Well, the majority in the council were on the opposite side of the fence. Politically, they were more conservative. They weren't fighting for independence, not yet anyway.
What were they fighting for then?
They wanted to restore the old Mexican federal constitution of 1824. They saw themselves as Mexican federalists fighting against Santa Anna's centralist dictatorship, not against Mexico itself.
And this wasn't just a minority opinion, right? Didn't the consultation itself say something about this?
Absolutely. Their own official statement, the unanimous declaration from November 7th, 1835, it explicitly says they took up arms only to defend that federal system Santa Anna had wrecked. They actually went out of their way to state they didn't want independence at that point.
Wow. So you have the executive branch, the governor driving towards secession, and the legislative branch, the council, trying to stay within Mexico just under the old rules. That's fundamentally incompatible.
Completely. It means every single issue, raising troops, getting money, supplying the soldiers on the frontier, it all becomes a proxy battle, independence versus federalism.
So what does that look like in practice? The sources use words like anarchy. How bad did it get in San Felipe where they were meeting?
It got pretty bad. The infighting basically shut down the government's ability to function. The main problem for the council became just showing up. After about January 10th, 1836, the records show the council often couldn't even get a quorum.
You mean they didn't have enough members present to legally conduct business?
Exactly. But that didn't always stop them. They kept trying to pass measures anyway.
Which basically means they were passing resolutions that weren't technically legal. That must have driven Governor Smith nuts.
Oh, absolutely. It gave him all the ammunition he needed. The sources say the council adopted, and this is a quote, measures anarchical in tendency and disastrous in results. They started bypassing the governor's authority, which was bad enough.
But they went further.
Yeah, they started meddling in military affairs, essentially trying to run things without going through the commander-in-chief, General Houston. They'd claim it was for the public good, but really they were setting up their own agents, making appointments outside the proper channels.
And Smith's reaction, I read some of his letters, and the language is intense.
Intense is putting it mildly. He wasn't just disagreeing, he was accusing them of, well, borderline treason. He put his fury down on paper, thankfully preserved for us.
What kind of things did he say?
He accused the council of passing resolutions without a quorum, predicated on false premises. He called them intriguing caucusing parties. He saw the whole thing as a deliberate plot by a few unprincipled men who had clan together to destroy his influence, specifically because he was pushing for independence.
So he thought they were undermining the revolution for their own political agenda.
That's exactly how he saw it. He believed they cared more about their faction than about the actual threat Texas was facing.
This couldn't last. What was the breaking point?
The council finally decided they'd had enough of Smith's attacks. They made a move to depose him. Essentially, they tried to stage an internal coup.
On what grounds? What was their justification?
They claimed he was neglecting his duties, acting outside the mandate given by the consultation. So in late January 1836, they went through the motions, declared his office vacant.
But it didn't quite work, did it? Which created this really bizarre situation.
Right. Smith refused to accept his deposition,
Yeah.
and crucially, key military figures backed him.
Ooh.
General Sam Houston, the commander-in-chief, refused to recognize the council's move. He saw it as just more chaos. And, importantly for our story, Colonel James C. Neal, the commander down at Bexar, also continued to recognize Smith as the legitimate governor.
So by early 1836, Texas essentially has, what, 2 governments? No government.
Functionally headless is a good way to put it. You've got a governor refusing to leave office, a council that can't legally meet but is still issuing orders, and a military command structure that's loyal to the governor but being actively undermined by the council. It's complete dysfunction.
Not exactly the united front you need when you're in the middle of a revolution.
It's practically a political civil war fought with angry letters and competing orders. And the real tragedy is that the soldiers, the guys on the frontier risking their lives, they're the ones caught in the middle.
And this paralysis, this infighting, it directly leads to a massive strategic mistake, doesn't it?
It does. Because the council felt blocked by Smith, unable to govern properly, they decided to go around everyone. And that led them to champion probably the single worst strategic idea of the entire revolution.
Which brings us to part 2, the Matamoros fever.
Exactly. This is where the political squabbling turns into a really dangerous military adventure. The council, looking for a way to assert its authority without Smith or Houston, latched onto this idea. The sources consistently call it the suicidal expedition proposed to capture Matamoros.
Matamoros, that's a port city way down south on the Rio Grande, right? Deep inside what was unquestionably Mexican territory. Why on earth would they think invading there was a good idea?
Well, it wasn't entirely irrational on the surface, at least to its supporters. These were often the same council members who favored the 1824 Constitution. They saw a couple of potential benefits.
Okay, like what? Beyond just, taking the fight to the enemy.
Money, mostly, and a political leverage. Matamoros had important customs houses. Capture the port, capture the customs revenue that could potentially fund the whole Texas cause.
A resource grab, basically.
Pretty much. Plus, they figured if they took territory deep in Mexico, it would curry favor with the Mexican Federalist Party, the ones who also opposed Santa Anna. They hoped the Federalists might then feel obliged to help Texas financially, maybe using those same customs revenues.
Okay, I can see the logic, even if it sounds incredibly risky. What did General Houston think? He was the commander-in-chief, after all.
Houston thought it was madness, pure and simple. He saw it as a reckless gamble that would fatally scatter Texas's already tiny military force. He knew they needed to concentrate their strength, not spread it thin on some invasion hundreds of miles away.
So did the soldiers want to go?
Oh, yeah. Houston himself noted the widespread enthusiasm for it among the volunteers. They were being promised action, glory, maybe even pay, which the provisional government wasn't providing. He literally called it the Matamoros fever. It was infectious.
So if Houston, the military commander, was dead set against it, how did the council push it through? Did they just overrule him?
They did more than overrule him. They actively undermined his command. Houston's strategy was clear. Defense. He argued very pragmatically, it is much easier to keep the war out of Texas. He wanted to build a defensive line, concentrate forces at key points like Goliad and Bexar.
Makes sense. Defend what you hold.
But the council's military committee was playing a double game. They'd issue these vague orders telling Houston to focus on defense, but then simultaneously they'd authorize and promote the Matamoros expedition. It created total confusion.
It sounds like they were deliberately trying to sideline him, using Matamoros as the excuse.
That's exactly how it looks in the records. The council passed specific resolutions giving what the sources called disorganizing powers to certain agents, completely independent of Houston.
Wait, disorganizing powers, they actually called it that.
Well, the historians analyzing the documents call it that, reflecting the outcome. They essentially created parallel military structures. They empowered guys like Colonel James Fannin and Francis W. Johnson to raise troops and gather supplies specifically for the Matamoros mission, reporting directly to the council, not Houston.
So Fannin and Johnson were operating outside the official chain of command.
Completely. And the sources are chillingly clear about the result. They state that giving Fannin these powers, independent of Houston, ultimately led to the slaughter of himself and the brave men under his command. That's looking ahead, obviously, but it shows how disastrous this split was.
It's incredible. The council's own committee recommended F.W. Johnson to command all troops he could gather from Matamoros, just totally ignoring the appointed commander-in-chief.
It fractured the army. You had Houston trying to organize a defense, and then you had Johnson and Fannin pulling men and resources away for this unauthorized invasion. It guaranteed chaos. When the real threat arrived, the Texian forces were scattered, divided, and pursuing a phantom objective. The political fight had effectively neutralized their own military.
So the Matamoros expedition wasn't just bad strategy. It was a political weapon used by the council against Smith and Houston.
That's a very accurate way to put it, a reckless political weapon. And now we need to look at where they pointed that weapon, because it was aimed squarely at the most critical and soon-to-be most famous point in the Texas defenses.
Which brings us to part 3. Stripping the Alamo.
Right. This is where the political mess directly translates into deadly danger on the ground. The Matamoros expedition wasn't just talk. It needed soldiers, cannons, food, medicine.
And where did Johnson and Fannin, the council's agents, go to get all that stuff?
They went straight to the existing garrisons. The few places Texas actually had soldiers concentrated. They targeted Goliad. And critically for our story, they targeted San Antonio de Bexar.
The very men who had just won the siege of Bexar.
The very same men. Johnson and Fannin went there specifically to recruit soldiers away from the Bexar garrison, and maybe even worse, to take supplies that Neal's men had captured from General Coos for their own Matamoros adventure.
So the men holding the frontier are being actively poached, and their hard-won supplies are being carted off by their own side for a mission the commander-in-chief thinks is suicidal. That's staggering.
It's a betrayal, really. And Colonel James C. Neal, the commander at Bexar, was caught right in the middle of it. His post was the furthest out, the most exposed, and now this Matamoros fever was sweeping through his own ranks, fueled by promises the actual government couldn't keep.
What was Neal saying about the situation? We have letters from him, right?
We do.
Mm-hmm.
His letters, especially one to Governor Smith around January 17th, 1836, are just desperate pleas. He's not just complaining about the Matamoros idea. He's talking basic survival. He states bluntly his men could not be fed and clothed on paper pledges.
No food, no clothes.
Exactly. He details how essential supplies just weren't there. And he points out that the government's chaotic actions were being misrepresented to the troops, causing massive discontent. Men were deserting because they weren't being supported.
So let me get this straight. The government tells Neal, hold Bexar, it's vital, but fails to send food or uniforms while simultaneously allowing other officers to come in and lure his men away with promises of glory and supplies for a different mission.
That's the tragic reality. The obsession with Matamoros vacuumed up everything. Men, food, clothing, ammunition, maybe even some of the captured cannons Neal needed for defense, all diverted away from Bexar. Every resource taken from Matamoros was essentially weakening the Alamo's defenses.
And the situation got so bad that Neal himself had to leave. That's how William Bear Travis ends up in temporary command, right?
Yep. Yes. It wasn't a planned transfer of command. In late January, Neal received word that his family was seriously ill. He was forced to leave his post temporarily to care for them. You can't blame him. The government wasn't supporting the garrison, and he had a personal crisis.
So he asked Travis, who was a lieutenant colonel, to take over while he was gone.
Correct. Travis wasn't sent there anticipating a massive siege. He was basically holding down the fort because the actual commander was forced out by circumstance and neglect.
And what kind of situation did Travis walk into?
He walked into a post that had been systematically gutted by political decisions made hundreds of miles away, and the state of the supplies was appalling. Travis himself confirms this in his own desperate letters later. He noted they had only, and this number is just shocking, 20 or 30 head of beeves.
20 or 30 cattle for the entire garrison.
That's it, maybe enough food for a few days for a full complement, certainly not enough to withstand a siege. The Matamoros fever had stripped Bexar bare. It was isolated, undermanned, and critically low on everything.
So the Alamo's vulnerability wasn't just bad luck or Santa Anna's overwhelming force.
Not at all. It was a direct result of the Texian government's own infighting and terrible strategic choices. The political failure in San Felipe directly created the conditions for military disaster in San Antonio.
While all this chaos is unfolding in Texas,
Mhm.
what's happening south of the border, that contrast is key here.
It's absolutely chilling. While the Texians are tearing themselves apart politically, arguing about constitutions, lacking quorums, chasing this Matamoros fantasy, the Mexican high command under Santa Anna is moving with terrifying purpose and unity.
Santa Anna wasn't interested in political debates anymore, was he?
Not in the slightest. He'd already ditched the 1824 federal constitution. He was building a centralist dictatorship, and the Texian rebellion was, in his eyes, an insult to Mexican sovereignty and a personal affront. Demanded absolute, brutal retribution.
He saw them as rebellious foreigners needing to be crushed.
Exactly. And he wasn't sending a small force. He was personally leading the main Mexican army of operations, marching north from San Luis Potosi. And the sources emphasize they were marching rapidly.
Rapidly, in the middle of winter, across that terrain. That must have been incredibly difficult.
A huge undertaking. Harsh conditions, logistical nightmares. But Santa Anna's determination to get there quickly, despite the winter, tells you everything about his mindset. He wanted swift, decisive vengeance. The Texians, meanwhile, probably assumed the winter would slow any Mexican response, adding to their complacency.
Did the Texians get any warning about this massive army heading their way?
There were warnings. Sources mentioned they were advised, even from outside Texas, to look well to the month of March and be ready.
But they didn't listen.
They couldn't seem to focus. All the energy was being sucked up by the political fights, the Matamoros debate, the attempted deposition of the governor. They were looking southeast, towards the coast for their own invasion, while the real danger, the overwhelming force, was marching directly towards their center, towards Bexar.
And Santa Anna wasn't coming in blind, was he? He had intelligence.
That's another crucial difference. Professionalism on the Mexican side. Santa Anna had sent Colonel Almonte on an intelligence mission into Texas back in 1834. Almonte did his job well. So Santa Anna had recent, accurate information about the layout, the political divisions, and, critically, the likely weak points in the Texian defenses.
So he probably already knew Bexar was isolated before the Matamoros plan made it even weaker.
He knew exactly where the vulnerable point was. The Texian political chaos was basically the best intelligence advantage he could have asked for. While they were arguing about who was in charge, he was making sure his command was absolute and focused.
And the speed of his advance units must have been a complete shock to whoever was left at the Alamo.
The speed was remarkable for the time and conditions. His advance guard elite dragoons, infantry battalions, they were already near San Antonio by February 21st, 1836.
February 21st, that's barely 6 weeks after the Texians celebrated their victory over Cos.
Right. While the Texian politicians were still squabbling, and guys like Fannin were trying to gather forces for Matamoros down near the coast, Santa Anna's army was already closing the ring around the Alamo.
Defended by a temporary commander and a skeleton crew with almost no food. It's unbelievable.
It really sets the stage for the tragedy to come.
Okay, let's wrap this up. Conclusion. Walking into a trap.
So let's just summarize the state of play by late January, early February 1836. The Texian Provisional Government. It hadn't just stalled. It had effectively imploded. Total paralysis thanks to the governor versus council feud.
And the military result, catastrophic. Texian forces were scattered all over the place. Some were down near Goliad, dreaming of Matamoros glory,
Lured by promises the government couldn't keep.
while others were just trying to hold on in isolated posts like Bexar.
And Bexar, San Antonio, the Alamo, the most vital defensive position they had been deliberately weakened. Stripped of men, cannons, food, medicine, all diverted for that pointless Matamoros mission. It was left isolated, undermanned, and completely unprepared for a real siege.
And right into that mess, that state of near anarchy and military decay, ride the figures who will become legends. They have no idea how bad things really are, do they?
None at all. It's the ultimate dramatic irony. First, you have the young, ambitious Lieutenant Colonel William Barrett Travis, sent by the governor, remember, just to hold the fort temporarily after Neil had to leave. He arrives just as the situation becomes critical.
A symbol of revolutionary fervor, basically handed an impossible task.
Pretty much. And then arriving just days, literally days, before Santa Anna's main force seals the perimeter.
The legend himself, David Crockett.
David Crockett, ex-congressman, world-famous frontiersman. He shows up with his small group of Tennessee volunteers ready to fight for Texas liberty. The sources say they took shelter in a room in the low barrack. They were walking straight into a fortress set up for failure by its own side, with barely enough food, facing thousands of determined soldiers.
They weren't just outnumbered, they were victims of their own government's incompetence before the first shot of the siege was even fired.
It's such a stark lesson, isn't it? How internal divisions, political squabbling, letting ideology blind you to reality, like that fixation on the 1824 Constitution at the expense of immediate defense, can be way more destructive than anything the enemy throws at you.
They ignored the storm gathering right outside their door because they were too busy fighting inside the house.
Perfectly put. And that storm was about to break with incredible fury.
So next time on our deep dive, the siege itself, the famous 13 Days of Glory. We'll look at Travis's desperate letters pleading for help, the fighting, the final assault, and the tragic, inevitable fall of a fortress that never really stood a chance, thanks to the seeds of disaster planted weeks before.
And maybe something for you, the listener, to think about until then. Can you recall another moment in history where such self-inflicted political wounds led so directly, so quickly, to such a devastating military outcome? Consider that as we prepare to enter the walls of the Alamo.